think at some point I'm going to introduce you as Reverend Jordan, or maybe DJ Jazzy Jordan.
Don't do that.
No?
I'll use Transmogrified the moment you say that.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Welcome back to Sermon Rewind. My name is Todd, and with me, as always, is Pastor Jordan Hall.
Good to see you.
We are again going to dive into a sermon, ask some questions, have a little discussion, and hopefully get a little deeper. Ready?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right. So this week's sermon, the title of the sermon was Ownership. The passage was from the book of Mark, chapter 8, verses 27 to 30. And your big idea was true confession denies lies, professes truth, and practices faithful obedience.
Got it.
Three-pronged approach to true confession. Mm-hmm. All right. So I'm going to jump straight into your points, and you had three of them, and we'll cover all three today. So your first point was oppose a lie even when it is popular.
Yeah.
Getting at the idea that sometimes we jump onto things because lots of other people are, even in the church.
Yep.
So speaking of the church, is there a lie that, from your perception, that we have embraced and perpetuated about what it means to be the church and followers of Christ?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You want to unpack that a little bit?
I should. I should do that. I think there's a bunch of them, and probably the more prevalent ones are probably what would be helpful. When looking at this text from Mark chapter 8, we're looking at essentially Jesus asking this question about himself in particular. So who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And then what do we do with that as a result? So I think when it comes to the person of Jesus, I think there's a multiplicity of lies, and some of them are unpacked in those first few verses that we talked about on Sunday, specifically that he is a prophet-like figure, right? This compassionate, loud, fiery, garnering lots of public acclaim and attention, the type of person you really want to hitch your wagon to, right? Nowadays, you might say, well, listen, we've got a provocative revolutionary on the cusp of really leading people into social reform and generosity across a myriad of spectrums. And while that's true, that's not an adequate way of talking about Jesus. And the reason why that is because Jesus himself doesn't let people land there, or at least not land there in totality, right? There may be things that are true about him, but there is one blazing white-hot center that answers that question. And that is where people struggle historically. And I think the Church of Jesus struggles with it, even though we would say we don't. And it's the lordship of Jesus. Is he, in fact, the ruling, reigning Lord of all creation? Is he truly the master, author, finisher, Alpha and Omega, any number of terms or adjectives you want to use to describe him? Is he the one who holds all things together by the power of his word and therefore is worthy of our worship, is worthy of our obedience? Most Christians would say yes, but their lives would articulate a very different belief around that. And so the lie is that he's anything less than that. There, in fact, is the lie, right? I think C.S. Lewis probably is the most popular for saying that he is one of two things, but he's not this giant gap in between, right? He's either the Lord or he's a liar. He's the Messiah or he's a madman, right? It can only be one of these two, because anybody who would say the types of things about himself that Jesus did is either those things or he's crazy. And to deduce him and accept the lowest possible hanging fruit, which is, but he was a good teacher. I mean, imagine doing that in any other scenario, right? You have a shirtless, crazy person running around the street with a chainsaw chasing children, and you have someone say, oh, but you know what? I know that guy, and he mowed my grandma's lawn 25 years ago. So he's not terrible, right? I'm going to accept this version of him. We can't do that with Jesus. Jesus won't allow us to do that. And there's too many people in the church who have said, I'm good with him because I like certain things about him, therefore he is this much Lord of my life. And that is a huge lie that Jesus himself won't accept.
So in your second point, you expanded on that and you said, own the truth even when it is unpopular. sort of the flip side of that,
Yeah.
but complementary. So knowing that I am sinful by nature, you're sinful by nature, we all are. And so our perspective on the truth as a construct is always going to be skewed.
Yeah.
We need God's grace in order to understand his teachings, his love, his grace. How do I ensure that my version of the truth as I go about my life is actually the word and will of God?
Give me an example of that.
So I'll take it more community-based. We as the church deciding that we can play a certain role in the community. So for example, there's a lot of balance between, say, reaching out to neighborhoods, being sensitive to people coming in that maybe are unfamiliar with the church, that sort of thing, versus it being a place where people understand what's going on. There's a certain culture. There's a certain, kind of way of doing things. So the idea of saying we can choose our role. Some churches maybe have the responsibility of sharing the gospel. Others don't necessarily have to do that. We can kind of be the upper division church, as it were.
Yeah, okay, yeah, for sure. And that's a big one. I think in American church and definitely in churches that I've known over the years. You almost hate to answer this so black and white because it's that same rationale that allows people to just kind of sweep things under the rug, right? That there has to be a gray area. I don't know that there is all the time. I think there is a reason why the biblical narrative that we're given, right? Our Old and New Testaments, the reason why we choose to believe these things as trustworthy and true is because for thousands of years now, people have accepted what they say as true, submitted their lives underneath kind of the authority of that truth, and watched those truths come to be as they claim they would be. So as a result, we have a long history of saying the Bible is the authoritative rule for the Christian life. And the Holy Spirit weaves us through it, and we live a life that is in step with it. So when it comes to things like evangelism or whether we can choose who we are or what type of church we'll be or what we'll emphasize, the scriptures are really clear about that. No, we are called as a collective people to make disciples of all nations, meaning all people, regardless of socioeconomic status, classification, age, sex, any number of things, right? So we're called as disciples to make disciples. It's very black and white. So if you evaluate your church under the guise of that rule and leadership, and you realize that you're not doing the things that are clearly stated that we must, well, then it should be a very clear indicator that your truth must subject to the truth, meaning your truth is now not true. And you may very well have a whole community of people who are like, but that's how we've always done it. And this is how I learned it growing up. And you still have the burden to say, my way may not be true, but let God's word always be true and every other man be a liar. It's a hard task, but that's the calling that we have for sure.
So in that same point, you were talking about our, you could say obligation, but really we look at it more positively as our opportunity and out of gratitude to boldly share the truth of the gospel. And you use the phrase, if someone asks, and you then went on to say you have the opportunity to share that gospel, to share that truth, even if it is uncomfortable, even if it's awkward for that person.
Yeah,
that's your opportunity. Were you suggesting that we should wait for someone to ask, maybe out of politeness or not forcing ourselves on it? And is that maybe a little bit of a passive approach to sharing the gospel? I'm going to wait until someone notices that I'm different, and then they'll ask, and then I'll share the gospel.
Yeah. Fair question to ask. I could totally see how easy it would be to assume that that's what I was meaning by that. There were a couple texts that were sort of bouncing around in my head for the last week or so when I was thinking about this. And one, because I get asked all the time, professional people in professional environments, man, I can't just go and shake my coworker or my desk mate and say, hey, listen, let's go have lunch. I want to tell you about Jesus. I just can't do that, right? I can't correct my boss when we're, in a meeting together and say, no, actually what you just said was not true. There is one Lord, one master over kind of all life, and his name is Jesus, and I need to tell you about him. There's just certain conduct and there's certain expectations that people of faith have to kind of navigate those waters very carefully. And the reason why I think that's the case is because Jesus himself said that, there is a necessity for Christians to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves, right? Which it's very picturesque, very romantic, but essentially what we're getting at is you need to know where you are, you need to know what you're doing, you need to think through all of the ways in which this can go well or go wrong. You need to consider the people. Are they ready to hear this? Are they interested in hearing it? Are you potentially throwing pearls before swine? Are you planting seeds in fertile soil? That there is a wisdom, right? There is a tact to the way that we carry ourselves as missionaries and confessional people in the earth. However, it's very easy, and maybe this is some of what you're getting at, it's very easy to now use that as a leveraging excuse, right? Well, it just didn't see, my wisdom was telling me it just wasn't the right time. And my experience has shown me that I really can't do it this way, so I'm going to do it this way instead. And often what ends up happening is people just take a back seat entirely, right? They just shut their mouths and never say anything. I once had a buddy of mine who would say all the time, well, I'm going to live in such a way that is very clearly Christian. And I would ask him, what about you just being a nice neighbor is evangelistically Christian? Like, how is the gospel made known? By just being a nice neighbor. I've known plenty of nice neighbors who are atheist psychopaths, right? That doesn't necessarily, like, your life in action isn't enough. There still requires a testimony, which is the very reason why I think Paul tells Timothy, preach the word, be ready in and out of season to exhort, to rebuke. He's telling this young believer, leader, right, that you are going to need to be, there isn't necessarily the right time or wrong time. There isn't always, the ability to put your hand on the pulse and know, like, this is the season to preach. You just need to be ready to do it. The opportunities may show up. This is what I meant by if someone asks, right? You might be in a setting that you were not prepared for, and someone just asks you, hey, do you ever pray? And you need to be ready for that. You need to be on guard. You need to be wise, prudent, and prepared at any given time to give an account of the good news of our gospel, because that is what we have to offer this world, and you absolutely do not know when it comes. So the admonition really is to be ready, right? Because I believe people will ask. I believe people will be searching, and I believe if you are shrewd and paying close attention and prepared, that you will seize more opportunities than you won't.
So in your third point, you said walk it out no matter what the cost. You mentioned jobs before, just as an example. And when we think about the church today, whether we think about it again as a group, as a community, or as we think about it individually, what costs make us the most nervous? How do we help each other let those go? Are there things that we have justified as, I don't want to risk this? Are we supposed to just say, well, maybe I should risk my job. Maybe I should risk my perspective on the legacy of the church, on what we think we are. Maybe we need to just boldly try something different. What are we holding on to? What are we afraid to lose? And how do we sort of work together and get past that?
Yeah. I think there's a good reason why all of our great heroes of the faith, whether they were biblical authors or, various centuried church leaders or just random blue-collar Joe Schmoes that God used in mighty ways. There's a reason why we have those heroes, and there's a reason why almost all of those heroes were massive risk takers. And they're known by these incredible feats and risks of faith that they took to make much of Jesus. And I think the reason why they're always so etched in our hearts are because we are petrified at losing. Western American evangelicalism does not have a good theology of loss. We don't really know what it's like to leverage everything because we believe that Jesus and his kingdom are worth it. It's not to say that we don't believe this inwardly, but we certainly don't believe it very often in action. Now, don't get me wrong. There are examples, right? There are people that we know that have and do all the time. And I'm not even saying that God demands that we do it every single day. I'm not saying that God demands you to lose your job. I'm not saying that God demands you to forfeit a 401k. I'm not saying that. But what I think is most interesting is how defensive we get at the prospect of that. What does it look like for us to not be so tight-fisted around the things that we hold dear? Safety, comfort, longevity. What does it look like for us to follow Jesus in a way that believes, from the text that we're going to be preaching on this upcoming Sunday, that believes that to lose our life is the way of gaining it? What does that really look like in 2022 in American culture? It's probably going to look different than it does in, the Middle East or Eastern Europe right now for that matter. But I think the thread weaves itself the same between both, regions and cultures. And so the best way for me to answer that without sort of immediately pointing at one thing in particular is to say, Christian, you have a duty and a calling right here, right now, to every day be preparing to let go of everything that you hold dear and to jump ship hand in hand with Jesus in faith, knowing that he will both catch you and carry you in the end. And I think we have a long road ahead of us to getting prepared for that. Hopefully, this is an exercise in that.
Thank you. Thank you again for joining us on Sermon Rewind. Feel free to leave comments or follow-up questions in the chat function of YouTube. Please subscribe, share this with other people, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
See you then.